Hello everyone, today we talk about the early challenges of the Kievan Rus in the international arena, specifically their relation with the Khazars, Byzantines, the most, but also the Pechenegs and other peoples. I talked about the origins of the early Rus some month ago, so I'm just continuing the series that I normally do for every country, just from the beginning of Schwerpunkt, looking at this particular aspect of the early foreign relations that partly overlaps naturally with other things we've seen even very recently in the video about Eurasian steppes warfare, such as the volatile steppe politics, but also the important degree of strategic projection of the early Rus, which is notorious. I mean, as we will see now, they reached the Caspian Sea, they rose up the Volga River to attack the Khazars. They stormed the suburbs of Constantinople, right? And there is more to it. There are the Magyars around. This is the same time we have documented some weeks ago with Great Moravia. So a lot of intertwinement, right? In a picture, by the way, that was still the one of consolidation of Eastern Europe under the Kievan Rus as such, right? We are in the time of Oleg that we have seen being part of the Rurikid clan fundamentally, and we had managed to descend from the north, from the Baltic fundamentally, and in taking control of Kiev, that was the major right center already flourishing in the frontier with the Khazars, and this power consolidation would be manifest in the wars were fought at this point to fundamentally sweep the way out of certain populations that were preventing the Rus from essentially reaching the Black Sea and so the Mediterranean, and thus taking control of some of the major trade routes in Western Eurasia. That's were controlled, in fact, at this point mostly by the Khazars and the Byzantines. That thus came in the orbit of the Rus as the fundamentally enemies, competitors. It is not that simple though, because you know that especially the Byzantine relations would normalize at some point and bring to the further civilization of the Kievan Rus, while the Khazar Khaganate was actually destroyed by the Rus. There were other peoples like the Pechenegs that were at times enemies, allies, etc. But overall, it's a pretty complicated picture that I will deal with also in much more in-depth videos. This is just like a broader presentation, like saying, you know, what was this all about, right? So as we've seen, this is still what we could call a Varangian phase, at least, even though it's the Slavic elites that fundamentally make the thing happen. Still, there is a consistent amount of Norse, also Finnic elements at some point, together with the Slavic ones, and the former one, the Viking ones, essentially as the spearhead, right? Mostly of this a Norse Slavic power. We can Norse Finnic Slavic power to a degree, mostly Slavic. And as always, this is not to say that the Slavs didn't have their own shock elements, their tough elites, and so on. So those will actually take over and already at this point make the bulk, right, of the Rus. But still, there is a bit this again Viking bias, right, in terms especially of maritime expansion, amphibious operations in this case, and we will appreciate it in part. In all this, I made videos about Byzantine history that document, at least from the Constantinopolitan side, what this looked like. Today we will talk, for example, about the essentially the aforementioned attacks on Constantinople, the major one, especially of 941 under Igor, but there had already been one before. That will be also treated in detail in other videos per se, but today we contextualize them a bit. So one aspect that would make us digress a lot if, I unfortunately didn't have the time just for a single video, is of course understanding what we were saying before, like what was the basis for the rapid Russian expansion, right? That's a hell of a question, and these are not times and spaces for which we have that substantial degree of information. We have archaeology that tells us a lot of interesting things, but overall, right, this doesn't have tags. It's a very vast area of a very amount of time, a long amount of time. There is not essentially a literate basis, right? Most of what we know comes from a later literature of the Rus that sometimes makes up certain aspects, but it's not much of a problem. Again, apparently the millennials, from the millennials onward, we were with some, of course, previous, wars, gradual worsening, is apparently mentally obsessed with the sense that history has been made up by some strange, first of all, the winners, the victors, that they always decide which one are the ones they have to blame or they don't have to blame, according to, of course, just subjective, radical moral subjectivism, of course. And that, secondly, there must be something deeper to things that nobody tells you. Somebody hid the truth and his utter BS. The point is that just there is no information because it's not normal to have it for, again, such times and places, right? For what the political and the social structures really were. And if something even later on was written and it was, generally speaking, wrong, whatever, it's never about, oh my God, so it was not true. It's about, as a historian can tell, about why was it written at that time, and that's mostly one of the single most eloquent historical information that we can be given about the times when these things were written, right, on the actual culture that at that point, in fact, we can finally document. And we're not fools. We have a pretty substantial idea, right, at least if you acquire a decent historical literacy, what was happening, even when we do not see it actually explicitated, right? What we see, though, and this is clear, is that the Russian expansion, in fact, was very fast, right? The shift of essentially especially Rurikid power from the north, from the Ladoga settlement, fortification, etc., towards major southern centers, and especially, again, the bigger one of Kiev, with the southern opening to the Black Sea, as we've seen, and also Steppes policy as far as this powerful, again, Turkic Khaganates had been established in previous centuries during the migration era, really opened this war to a completely different dimension. And again, everything was being prepared, right? The Russian cities, in this sense, were, again, what are we talking about, right? What we call Rus, let's put it, the Slavic centers were, again, just needing that kind of leadership, also in full, let's say, syntony with kind of the local customs. The idea of calling a ruler to a certain place is completely the customary and traditional for peoples living in the Middle Ages, right? You always have essentially a guy that is brought from another country because he doesn't actually have much power, in as much as, you can control him better when it's locally there. Most people interpret this thing, oh my God, these people ruled over this other, oh my God, this is the hyper-masculine, machist. This is actually one of the single most radically inferior forms of personal, and cerebral development. It's actually the diametrically opposite view of the virile sense of, in fact, imperial Catholic domination, which is at the root of every single true tradition. Again, what I was saying before is that this bias towards tribalism is notoriously anti-traditional for anybody who knows what actual tradition really is, right? Tradition is about ruling every single people in the world, right? And the way you do it, yes, is convincing them that you are worth ruling them, because you cannot do it really without them in the first place. And the condition there is moral, right? That is, there are more or less, say, imbalances as far as this happens, right? Which is never just the form of government per se, but also the actual. But there are tendencies, there are trends, right? The most authoritarianistic powers are notoriously also the weakest, right? Because they are sustained by essentially lesser people that decide that basically that they're better entrenched with sort of, messianic. Okay, think about it yourself. I don't want to know anything. Just I let you in power, but don't count on me, kind of thing. And this is, of course, cultural abortion, right, for any country where this mostly happening, unsurprisingly, mostly in communistic countries, and this, unfortunately, having a very deep historical root, right, among populations that were essentially exaggerated from centuries, if not more, from actually, had direct control on their lives, right? So, even if you live in a tribe, you can actually live like that, because the tribe in itself may be that weak that is incapable of opposing itself to a greater power. So again, there is no easy dichotomy in that sense, that there is not kind of freedom is not a value, right? Freedom literally means that you are out there, right, up to something that you can easily fail in, because you may not be worth anything, right? So that, of course, freedom at that point is completely useless, right? The entire civilizational, again, imperial Catholic tradition is founded on the concept of liberty, which is a completely different one. And it has to do with the constant wrestling, let's say, between the ruler and the subject for the divine transfiguration, right? The glories of apotheosis, and basically the entire Western identity is based on this, right? On enlightened elites that were able to co-opt the masses with the with the promise of essentially elevation of divine metaphysical standard. Aside from this, however, this is important because, as anecdotal as it may sound, actually this is the world in which the Rus lived. Right, nobody thought, again, this BS that emerged as the standard political beliefs from the 19th and the 20th century. This is the fourth estate one for the lesser people, right? The ones that objectively do not count anything in relative terms, as it's very evident nowadays. These worlds are radically and brutally and traumatically different. Of course, you wouldn't be able, of course, to live in there, right? It's not even about surviving. Just you probably do not have the mental capacity, 95% of the cases, right, to even understand how the world actually works. Not that world, because you've, again, been brainwashed with this concept. Everything was different because, there are all different things and nothing makes sense, right? No, these peoples believe on a radical objective reality that had to do with the most obvious absolute value represented by God himself, right? And there are no gods, right? What you call paganism is based on the sole radical concept of a single God, right? Of which all the rest is just an hypostasis, right? So this other bullshit that, there were, the pagans, the monotheists, and this other thing is just, if you believe in that as an actual adult, my compliments, because you wouldn't even pass a first-year medieval history manualistic exam if you found me, among the, the assistants. And just the mere fact that these rulers, eventually with the Slavic suffixes, Slav meaning glory, mir meaning peace, world in a sense of kind of, again, world domination in arms, right? Peace in arms, like the Germanic Friede. Again, it's the same imperialistic concept of the Roman Empire everywhere. That's the only absolute value that exists exclusively for men, right? That there is no other category here that can handle the imperium by archetypal, metaphysical absolute. And the world here is about making the thing happen, right? So when you see this quick expansions, you realize there is a risk sometimes civilizationally this thing again doesn't have enough support, but there is also an incredibly powerful load, right, moral load that at this point is even in such a huge space like the one between the Baltic and the Black Sea. So these rulers rising like to a shared to a shared consensus, to this kind of force that was ready to be spent, it was given in as much as the subjects wanted to be led against other peoples and crushing them, becoming more powerful, right? This is the greatest, most beautiful, and purest identity of the Kievan Rus, right? The main threat in this picture, at least the main competitors, the ones that had instead embodied that from the Turkic side of the story, like coming from a very different background, naturally from the Indo-European Slavic one of Central Eastern Europe, the world of the forest, the Turks coming from the Central Asian steppes and so on, was indeed the relation with the Khazars, the Khazar Khaganate that had, of course, other neighbors of the Pontic steppe, but especially the Khazars, as these dominate basically this entire space from the Volga-Don steppes to the eastern Crimea and the northern Caucasus. Essentially, during the 8th century, you have the Apex. These people, again, made a couple of videos about them. That is known as the Pax Khazarica, right? So it's the Latinization, modeled after the Pax Romana, referring to the to the general power and deterrent that the Khazar Khaganate had, especially consolidating trading relations and frequent military alliances with the Byzantine Empire against the Persians, the Arabs. As we've seen in the recent video about Khazar warfare, etc., the Abbasid Caliphate had even clashed across the Caucasus in the north and invaded the western coast of at least the northern western coast of the Caspian Sea, effectively managing to dislodge the Khazars, at least from part of this region. Interestingly enough, at this point, the Slavs had sided with the Khazars because objectively the Caliphate was a greater threat, right? If there hadn't been the Khazars in the 8th century, if you look at the map, you realize that the Muslims could have simply, followed the Black Sea coast, could have consolidated their Caucasian holdings and essentially threatened Constantinople from the north, right, the northeast, right, passing through Crimea, the Danubian corridor, etc. This is not Fanta politics, let's say. It's actual and solid, international one of the time, because in fact the Khazars instead were in between. And even though, again, the Caliphal armies were one of the most brutally advanced of the time, the difficulties in essentially dislodging a Turkic people from essentially the steppes in areas where you can't quite concentrate power unless you start leaving, like with this decentralized form, like entrusting it to some kind of nomads, etc. You can't quite make a headway, and objectively the Abbasids had just a bit of other problems on their own, closer ones to think about, including the same Byzantine Empire, but from Anatolia. In any case, that's another theater that we can see on another occasion. But the Khazars, as you know, had turned out quite useful for Constantinople exactly for this reason, because of course they offended the Caliphate from the north, launching these raids south of the Caucasus, prompting again the Islamic response. Some of them to be becoming more presentable in this kind of international relations, converted to Judaism, some to Christianity, some to Islam themselves. But the former was a way to say, okay, we convert to this different, like to this Abrahamic cult, because it's the thing here apparently among the Senatries. But as we were saying before, they basically overlap in almost everything, just a degree of how you consider the possibility of transfiguration likely or not, right? It's literally the only difference existing between these creeds and properly. It's the same tradition. There's never been a different religion. It's just different interpretations of the same traditional concept. In any case, this is not just as if we were Christians or Muslims. We are Jews because that characterizes us most. And again, these peoples were, most of them remained what we would call pagan. But this tells you also the sense of grandeur that the Khazars, sensed for themselves. A great part of this will be inherited by the Rus who crushed them. Right? This is important as far as the Russian history is concerned. And there were even imperial marriages, Khazar princesses conveniently converted to Christianity for marrying with some emperor. So it was at that level of prestige, of power, of ecumenic rule. As you know, that the Khazars had other neighbors in the east. There was always the problem of the steppes, other waves coming, as we'll see now with the Pechenegs, the Magyars versus the Pechenegs, but in fact the Kipchaks. But there was Volga, Bulgaria in the north was a sort of client state, but still enjoying relative, autonomy. Next door were there was the homeland of the Ugra-Finns, from which the Magyars, in fact, descended. So again, we will consider these things too later. The Khazar problems are crucial because, from one side, again, we explained this in the other videos about the same Khazar warfare, the Slavs had been emerging in the wake of this great Khazar power, right? In Eastern Europe. They had benefited from this Pax Khazarica, the trade routes, east-west, north-south. It was a terrific position during the Viking era. That's the reason why you have the North crossing right from the Baltic to the Black Sea to the Caspian Sea, because there is a major, we are in the 8th century, there is a revival of international trade. A major route that passes through these places that is reactivated by the Vikings, lots of slave trade. Basically, it's all about slave trade. So there's a lot of war, right? And those who know how to make the headway, as we have seen, as mercenaries, guards, and even rulers within the same powers. Think about in the same Varangians in the Byzantine Empire. Think just about the guys and as the palace guards and all kind of cocky with double hand axes and mail and so on. But we underestimate the fact that there was a massive amount of Scandinavians that literally, because the Varangian Guard was an autonomous army. It was not just like an elite guard unit, right? And there were lots of them settled in the Balkans, right? Aside from the fact that throughout all this time, we can't track, as we were saying before, all the actual Norse bands that descended through, I don't know, the Carpathians, they settled. They probably joined the Magyars in their raids in Western, in Central Europe, etc. But there was a lot of movement going on, right? And the Slavs that had been gradually, also with a lot of demographic and agricultural drive, understood what their potential really was. So Kiev herself, as we've seen, emerged as a Khazar stronghold that was just paying a tribute to the Khaganate, and the local Slavs were just making trade business. They had their own militias. They participated to Khazar expeditions, so they knew what that business really was about. Again, they supported the Khazars against the caliphs. They joined. I mean, they had their own war bands. There was a degree of Slavic, piracy akin just to the one of the Vikings, which is somehow underappreciated. If you think about the Pomeranians, we will talk about this also in the videos about probably medieval warfare. Stricto sensu. However, again, there is a change here that triggers in part at least the Slavic awareness that they can make a substantial coup and taking over the system, right, and turning the tides, right, and literally in a level of trade balance, right, how much precious metal could be treasured in some of these Slavic strongholds, the fact that most of them were in the forest areas, so yeah, they were tributaries of the Khazars, but they couldn't quite be reached like on a longer, right? It's just like with the Mongols later on, right? So this favors them in a way. And the trade centers that emerge again are impressive. These are areas that have never known urbanization before, so you realize the entity of the potential being put to action, let's say in this time in history, when you realize all these kind of fortresses, strongholds along rising along the great Rusian rivers. The big change had been the following: the collapse of the Göktürk Khaganate. Right, this had been the truly first hegemonic, universal, ecumenic Turkic empire. Right, had been in many ways also the only one. Like, the peak was reached by them. Admittedly, it was just a set of confederacies. There was mostly an eastern part, a western part, and the divine dynasty that ruled it managed to basically live in all these branches, including ruling, including among the Khazars, right? So if you look at the Rurikids, the early Piasts in Poland, etc., we realize that there was much of this kind of steppes flavor being, added up to Scandinavia. If you actually look at European geography, it's pretty evident, right? The steppes admittedly continue up to the Hungarian plain. It would be considered the Hungarian plain, but like if you go straight from, say, between the Urals and the Aral Sea and / lake, whatever you want to call it, and that's the steppe corridor. You arrive again north of the Caucasus, then across today's Ukraine, say in the Pontic steppe. Then you can go south along the Danube, but then there are the Balkan Mountains, the Carpathians. But if you follow the Carpathians in the north, you arrive in the Sudet, and there's this thing, and you arrive literally at the gates of Germany, in this sense that even towards the 11th century, 1/3 of the Polish armies were mounted. It tells you a lot about how heavy this kind of seigneurial autocratic power really was, right? Except, again, the sedentary Indo-European substratum there was something different, something sedentary. It had the upper hand, and so it's between the combination of these two elements, right, of tradition and modernity, if you want, depending on which aspect we're talking about of the individual cultures, that you sense this enormous potential, right? And this is not just between the Slavs and the Turks. This is incidentally, and that's why, again, this area is so successful in this period in history, between the Norse and the Byzantines, and all that enriched the Rus for Kiev to rise to hegemony. This is incredible. Like, it's rare to find such major concentration of forces and resources in relative terms in a single place in time, right? And normally when it happens, big things come out. The Göktürk Khaganate had collapsed, right? So this had brought other people from the west naturally to push further west, namely the Magyars, the Pechenegs, or Patzinegs, whatever you want to call them in transliteration, and other, so we call them like this, but as you understand, these were Ugrians and Turkic peoples that were, ancient, that mostly so in identitary sense, politically wise, and there were lots of other elements. The previous Iranians, there were some, even of the same Slavs, the same things. I mean, you do not know here. There is not a real boundary for a very extended amount of territory up to Central Asia, right? So further peoples from the eastern extremes were surely migrating west into the steppes region. And this was definitely a moment of crisis and instability for the Khazar Khaganate that would never quite recover, also because the Rus would come to put an end to the freaking thing. So these new peoples are injected in that space. They bring to some sort of turmoil. The Khazars control a pretty large space, but some of the most important in the steppes corridor is agitated. As a consequence, there is war. Resources are consumed. So each of these peoples, we see them like going back and forth in these things. But if you had seen properly the political or strategic contingencies or needs of them, you would understand how how tied to specific, again, even a minimal thing could destabilize the whole system, right? So here the disruption of trade, over which most of a steppe powers mostly relies on, as far as his chances of their chances of stabilization of territorially can derive, because literally in the steppes you can't do that differently at this point. And so a great instability in which the same Rus and Slavs participate, right? What is interesting is that both the Vikings and the Slavs had participated themselves, as we said, in the Khazar military expeditions against the Arabs on the Caucasus. So most of what you see actually in Viking era expeditions arriving up to the Caspian Sea, Persia, and beyond, were already the normal invasion routes of the Khazars that, leaving space to these other peoples in the West, were just followed by the latter in the same way. So at this point, how does this? What was the main objective of the Rus? Basically, was especially controlling, securing trade routes. Right. What is fascinating is that, again, between the forest and the Black Sea, you have the steppes in between. So at different points in Kievan history, as we will see, there is not necessarily a contiguous territorial control. That's not what you need. At point you need really, also because, again, it's really impossible to occupy all of these territories, right? So what really matters is occupying, garrisoning, defending, just certain choke points, certain trade squares, and exacting the tolls and having enough military force to essentially even move this wealth back and forth, right? Consolidating wherever this resources could be distributed, and that's it, right? Then your territorial control will fundamentally expand accordingly, because if you have enough manpower and resources just to deter anyone from kind of setting foot in a certain amount of territory, that's it, right? The people we inhabit there will just pay tribute to you, so we'll become ever more powerful. So this is the game. It's not about major expeditions or destroying the entire system. It's just giving. First of all, there is literally no power to do that from both sides, because in early Middle Ages, these resources were relatively limited. And that's again how it was not needed. It would have been an extraordinary waste of resources that would have been foolish to even think of. And they just clash for this or that choke point, and they start. And there is also an attritional dimension where you want to destroy when you cannot control those trade centers that. You cannot hold. You cannot hold on a longer time. So making a sort of scorched earth strategy, which again always happens when you cannot. You expect not to be able to settle in that territory. At least you are not able to bet on the fact that you will eventually take control of it for a time, which the destruction of what you will destroy, in fact. Will be a harm for the occupier later on, the conqueror later on. this happens from both sides. So you immediately understand that, as we've seen also from the panoply of the Khazars in the other videos, and of the Rus, etc., how, let's say, truly mixed, right? The military culture, fighting techniques, etc., of these peoples really were. Because some of them stereotypically were quite different, right? But we are also talking about a time in history where it doesn't matter how different in style you are, it's just relative, right? People fight pretty much in very similar ways. Yes, there is a divide between the steppe and the cemeteries, but there is also a lot of similarities, like in the concept of warriors, especially in the elites, right? That are the ones who can more, who can equip themselves with more and switch to different types of skills, let's say fighting styles, let's put it in this way. There wasn't just, however, the Khazar Khaganate and the Rus principalities here. There was another and the stronger opponent, the Byzantine Empire, right? That was actually very clever, as it had been habituated to do so for surviving, really, taking advantage of the turmoil, especially of the Khazar Empire. That was again the most, the second power. So when this crumbles, the first immediately expands in its sphere of influence. And this expansion occurs in different ways. It's also military, but it's a matter apparently of political influence, commercial relationships. It's the Byzantines that want to, again, secure control of certain choke points inland, places like Crimea, Tanais, right, and other trade centers. The same goes for the Rus, right? Meaning that it also is for other steppe groups aside from the Khazars, meaning that all these peoples are witnessing the extension of the Constantinopolitan power in the Black Sea, right, and its ports and its on its coasts, and that's again mostly what they need, because if you control the coast, you do not need it. The Byzantines have essentially a naval superiority up to this point, so they don't, that there is no power around that can really threaten them in that sense. They can just especially in the Black Sea, if they control the choke, or if you control the coasts, that's where stuff is exported south from other places. It's to the same Constantinople, right? The point is how many tolls you can exact locally, and you control the choke point, it's that, right? There's no infrastructure or geography that allows, or political or social capacity that allows to circumvent the trade. Of course, admittedly, some would slip away to other routes, of course, especially when there was enough instability in the area to dissuade the merchants to cross. And that's why the Byzantines actually want to expand, but to consolidate immediately, right? They do not like that there is such instability, at least to some degree, depending on how much they can directly control and how much they can also, as we'll see now with the essentially the betrayal of the Khazars for the Pechenegs, avert some big power like the Khazar one had been to reconsolidate. The Byzantines established the theme of Kherson, originally formally called the Klimata, right? A theme located essentially in southern Crimea, headquartered at Kherson, in the 30s of the 9th century, right? So, and interestingly enough, a consistent part of this, the reason for the establishment of this theme was to defend against the raids by the Rus that were already quite, turbulent at this point, protecting vital grain shipment, supplying Constantinople. That was the actual big concern ever since the capital had lost control of Egypt, right, to the the Muslims. So these areas were becoming really strategical, and the Byzantines wouldn't let themselves slip the opportunity to consolidate in there. Plus, historically they had been somehow Byzantine areas themselves. I mean, from the time of Hellenic colonization, more or less, that they had been part later on of the Roman Empire, and so it was just at least the coast. Even the Crimean hinterland was very steppish in culture and warlike qualities, let's say. But again, the civilization holds the stronger holdings, and has the capacity also of resupplying them by sea, which it's a big deal. In fact, the Byzantines are already aware of the naval potential of the Rus, and they fear that, of course, losing those strongholds would lead to, as it would happen, to a substantial maritime threat, right? So Kherson served also as a key diplomatic link with the Saint Khazars and others on the steppe, right? Became the center of the Black Sea commerce. At this point, again, the trade balance was tilting in favor of Constantinople. That just, by influence, of course, was already the most attractive market for a great part of Europe and Mediterranean and the Near East and so on. Now, the Byzantines also helped the Khazars at this point to build a fortress in the essentially in the east of their possessions that would become Sarko. Right, this was a center the Khazars had already been accumulating power on. Again, just like other raiders, they needed some entrenched, fortified rings where to store the loot and so on. So these this fortresses were rising more or less in the same way, a bit bit more Turkic flavored than the Slavic, with the Slavic ones in Eastern Europe, as we've seen, again, keep being part of some similar picture. The purpose, this was Sarkel on the Don River, right? So it actually reaches Tanais, that there is on the Azov Sea. At the time, was known as the Myocean Swamp. That's how the Romans had called it, like less romantically, but. That was already like a Byzantine controlled area, right? So most of the traffic coming from the Khazar capital would pass through the hands of the Byzantines, and the latter's hope was, at least for the Khazars, to be robust enough to protect themselves in the east, right? But not being so, heavy in the west, right? So that the Byzantines would maintain the upper hand and essentially secure most of the trade in the area. Because, as we've seen, Turkic migrants were invading the region, the same Rus were becoming ever more aggressive, showing what was going on. So the caravan trade routes and the portage between the Don and the Volga rivers seemed, say, particularly relevant for the Byzantines to care about, because it was, in a sense, too far from being reached. It was essentially exceeded the direct capacity of intervention of the empire. So they needed to strengthen a sort of buffer state that would at least partially secure it against all these other movements of people. The Byzantines were quite skilled in this, again, because they knew all these waves of Turks from quite a long time, from the time, from the one of the Huns, as a matter of fact. So they had a hell of an intelligence to properly get to know what was happening, who was involved, etc., to eventually act, right, politically, militarily, etc. Now, the Rus in all this are keeping to pressure on, especially the Khazars, because again, these are the weaker ones, the ones having the worst of this whole situation, and they began to deprive them of territory, tributaries, and trade. Right? Again, as we were saying before, you mostly control other communities. Your entire government is based on how well received you are, or not, by the way, by the locals, right? All these, especially the steppe peoples, have a strong imperialistic, tributary kind of warlike attitude, because if they don't keep up with that threat being credible, the subjects will, grow confident enough and reverse the tide. The Rus are essentially doing the same. They are in part sponsoring the rebellion of other groups, but they're arriving there themselves and starting to dictate rule themselves. In around 890, Oleg, so the Prince of Kiev, waged an indecisive war in the lands of the lower Dniester and Dnipro rivers with the Tiversi and the Ulichs. These were other Slavic peoples, interestingly enough, East Slavs, respectively settled in the area of, again, near the Dniester River, probably the lower Danube, so more or less, say, modern-day Western Ukraine Republic of Moldova, while the Ulichs were settled between, say, more or less in Bessarabia, right? So somewhere between the Dnipro, the Bug River, and the Black Sea littoral. I made a video about medieval Moldova, so if you're interested in that, you'll see at least how the situation evolved, because these areas were, especially the ones towards the Black Sea, as we've seen, were poorer because there is immediately the steppes above them, right? So nothing to do with the area of Kiev, that is much more, again, continental and also more forested and better for agriculture, and again, still controlling the major riverway of the Dnieper, etc. So it's really where the central power is. It's a push towards the south, it's a push towards the sea, and also a push towards the Carpathians, telling the truth, because if you control that choke point between the Black Sea and the Carpathians, you can launch raids further south, even towards Constantinople, so assisting them in so. And we will see that the Byzantines were already aware of this and tried to play with what other peoples, like one another, intervened. Right? There was the first Bulgarian Empire at this point was, as you know, like a looming threat just next door to Constantinople. First, the Byzantines used the Magyars, then they sent the Pechenegs in, and those are interestingly interfering, as we will see, because this stripe of land was very steppe-like in the sense that at least it was the corridor in which all the nomadic peoples reversed themselves, say, through in order to reach the lower Danube, the Hungarian plains, right? So it was actually a daring decision to carry out such a thing, but again, it could be remunerative as well, as if you reach, as we've seen with the Huns, with the Avars, with the Magyars. Now it was happening exactly in these years. In 894, right, Magyars and Pechenegs were drawn in the wars between the Byzantines and the Bulgarians. That were attacked, in fact, by the Magyars, that had in turn been called by Constantinople, attacking Bulgaria from the north. And it's the Bulgarians that persuade the Pechenegs to attack the Magyars from the rear. And the Pechenegs kept being used by the Byzantines basically in the same function, because the Magyars at the end of the day managed to migrate further west across the Carpathian Mountains into the Hungarian plain. And so it's like even a further, enemy settled in Europe to threaten mostly the middle Danube, to contend it from the empire. and still Pecheniks are out there. And they actually established a hell of a power that will be an important, say, element of, say, in Russian history, at least in the following centuries, especially that we won't see today. However, the interesting picture here is that the Magyars, up to that point, as they were located still in between, again, they didn't know whether to remain in the Pontic steppe or to migrate in the Hungarian plain up to that point, were allies of the Khazars against the Rus, right? They had managed to cross, and the Khazars naturally were quite happy with that, right, to have sent further west, basically out of their, if not of their sphere of influence, still out of their main, territory and territorial, domination, and again, not threatening any major trade route at that point. Now, but while they move away, like this quite smart warlike people is just going away, and those who are more advantaged by this are the Rus, that otherwise would have had more problems too. At least they should have at least gone at war against the Magyars, which was not, something nobody really was looking forward to. Also because, as you understand, all these peoples are fundamentally nomadic in nature, more or less, right? So in order to crush them, again, you have to go out there in open ground, in the steppes, again against nomadic peoples that can't simply carry out a scorched earth strategy as much as tactics, hit and run attacks, and wearing out a consistent amount of forces for you to basically control nothing, because in between there is literally nothing. Except beyond that, as we were saying, there are the ports, where there is the coast, there is the sea, which now, in fact, can be accessed by the Rus, because the Magyars have moved, right? So, and there is nobody in between them, if not this kind of, again, local, smaller, poorer Slavic realities that can easily be crushed or at least reduced to... There were fierce fights, right? Single battles could determine lots of things in this context, but overall, right, surely the Rus can threaten the aforementioned people, while these ones can at best resist them. The first thing the Rus do, this is fascinating, as they gain access to the Black Sea, is launching raids into Khazar territory. First of all, they follow the coast, right, of the Black Sea. Then they arrive to the Don River mouth and they start rising it up, right, and they reach up to the lower Volga region. It's very far away, because you have to go down south, then you immediately northeast again, right? So these expeditions are naturally very piratic in nature. We don't have, like, an army of 30,000 men making major expedition to crush, Sarkel, whatever. No, but as we were saying before, traditionally speaking, this causes, for the already weakened Khazar Khaganate, a pretty severe damage. The Rus raid, plunder, they reach, they manage to cross the Khazar territory. This tells you, even against the threat of the nomadic tactics, let's say, how, peoples like the Norse, the Slavs, had the capacity. They had their own cavalry, they had their own horse archers, they had their own, as we've seen, even nomadic tributaries already, so they knew how to organize their own expeditions, amphibious ones. We're told of very ingenious things. They could carry even the horses naturally on their ships, and these raids are very successful, right? From 864 they reach the Caspian Sea in all these expeditions. There is in 913, however, the properly later first large-scale one, right, which strikes an area that is basically the one from it's the Caspian Sea coast from the Caucasus to, in fact, Iran, right, and even into fairly, up to fairly east and south degree, like Baku. It's the first one. Then there is the Gilan, Arid and Mazandaran one, right? So this brings them again in places like they have been in Hyrcania, and those are also the ones from which the Persians actually trade with the Khazars, right? A bit like the same areas of the Land Lease during World War II, right? That's the same reason why Stalingrad didn't have to fall, because that's where they received at the mouth of the Volga all the British, the American equipment, right, in the Soviet Union. Here it's similar in a way if you think about that. The same places strategically. Naturally, there are several raids of this kind, and they are aimed surely at disrupting that kind of trade routes, because at the end of the day, this would have entailed those merchants that felt threatened to cross those routes, to go along the routes, to move more likely towards the west, right? So these raids were surely not calculated to simply do that in a longer time perspective, but it was still a way to affirm, like, further an Eastern European power in the neighboring areas, right, as at least a sphere of influence, as a profitable market overall, also because what they looted, they brought back and they sold it from their homeland, right, to, again, very far away places. Again, now we're looking just at the major routes, but there are lots of course, unknown expeditions, and there wouldn't be anything strange if some of these raiders had arrived up to Central Asia or even India, or God knows where, right? From the other side, they reached North America. So, as you understand, it's quite a... What concerns the Rus, however, is mostly consolidating political and territorial dominion in Eastern Europe. That is the landmass, where it's a place where the people are, where the resources, the agricultural ones really are, and it's so well located for raiding those other areas that, as we're seeing, are giving way to their pressure now, that it's really a successful enterprise. As a consequence, during the 10th century, the Khazars were no longer able to command tribute from the Volga Bulgars in the northeast. Say, but what does this have to do with them, actually? Well, because the Volga there is still, like, in the lower part, in the hand of the Khazars, and the Bulgars are just rising up the river further northeast, right? So that's from the diametrically opposed direction, which the Rus really is. Right, but what has actually happened, aside from the direction from which this attacks came, is that, of course, the Khazars had been weakened to the point that the Volga Bulgars had begun to autonomize themselves, and even actually establishing more consistent connections with the Rus themselves. Right. Also, the Khazar relations with the Byzantines deteriorated, because nobody sides with the weaker at some point. You can't try to support someone as long as it takes for achieving a certain result. But let's say if this thing is collapsing, of course it doesn't make sense to support it anymore, and it never happens, in fact, historically. So Constantinople thought at this point that the best ally in the area are the Pechenegs, right? Because the Pechenegs are actually a relatively fragmented people. They're not like the Khazar Khaganate. They're not a single polity, right? Not especially a territorial one like the Khazars had managed, right, even from a nomadic background, to actually establish to a degree of semi-sedentarism. The Pechenegs are all different tribes. They're all divided, but what keeps them together is the fact that they inhabit the steppes, and so completely different dynamic that brings them to carry out raids and uniting forces. They would be mostly a problem for the Rus at a point. The Pechenegs were task-free. They were given a green light by the Byzantines to simply raid the lands of the Khazars. Right? As I was saying before, the Byzantines simply, dumped the Khazars at that point. And these raids were carried out from their base between the Volga and the Don rivers, allowing them to expand even further west, though. This was done by the Byzantines in anti-Rus function at that point, because they realized that these had become powerful now, and they needed the Pechenegs to be strong enough, and even to push west enough to even, as we've seen, maybe harass the Bulgarians. So there were lots of reasons why they would support them. As far as the Rus are concerned, well, there's not just war with the Pechenegs, telling the truth. Sometimes they allied with one another, sometimes went at war with one another, because, again, they were so politically divided that at a point, it mostly was a matter of internal policy of the Pecheneg world, so that if you weakened them, if you managed to make them fight against one another, it was better for the Rus, mostly in the air. In part, it's because of this different directions they could take. It's either Bulgaria or what remains of the Khazars, or even other areas. In any case, there were two fairly distinct peoples with the Rus, because the Pechenegs were nomads roaming the steppes, raising livestock. They traded with the Rus for agricultural goods and other products, but the latter were just mostly in the forest areas in the sanitary world. And even though they had the upper hand, they would launch expeditions against the same Pechenegs in the steppes. They mostly treated them as tributaries themselves, right? The lucrative Rus trade with the Byzantine Empire had to pass through the Pecheneg-controlled territory, right? So this is another factor that doesn't really make anyone just wanting these people to simply go away, right? It's because, again, you can't quite reach them easily. We can't crush them, we can't wipe them out so easily. The Khazars could be, because, again, they had some more fixed centers. These ones are constantly unstable, and they always cause problem for a group or another, and they become a proxy for the Rus and the Byzantines for their own tension, right? In the Russian Primary Chronicle, we are told that the Pechenegs entered the Rus territory at some point in 915 to even settle in part then. So in fact, the two made peace. And albeit being at war again in 920, the Pechenegs would assist the Rus in the same later campaigns against the Byzantine Empire. Right. In other moments, it would be allies with the Byzantines against the Rus. Again, it really depends. It's that messy. But in fact, the most important relation at this point is between the Rus and the Byzantines themselves. There was an attack on Constantinople in 860. At this point, the Byzantine Patriarch Photius sent missionaries to convert the Rus and the Slavs in general to Christianity. This is the time of, as we've seen in the video of Great Moravia, of Prince Rastislav, that requested the Byzantine Emperor to provide him with teachers to interpret the Holy Scriptures. This is the moment of birth of this Slavonic language, right? The Old Church Slavonic, that derived from the 863 mission of the brothers Cyril and Methodius that were sent essentially from Bulgaria, Byzantine frontier with Bulgaria to convert Central European peoples. Arguably, the Byzantines were losing the struggle with Rome and with the Franks, because now they were just converting the Slavs and the Khazars in part. So again, not properly the most powerful polities up to that point. But the Rus, in fact, was consolidating as one at least, and for now it was hostile. So the process of evangelization was quite auspicable, because they understood that if they could essentially make them, if they were interested in the first place in becoming a great power, they couldn't do without a permanent infrastructural, an ecclesiastical administration, right? They needed a more concentrated political hierarchy to rely also on a more definite creed that would be used to order the subjects as well. So this process would take a while, because as we will see, like, you just have a cluster of different principalities mostly that is forming. Some of these are probably far away from not much from Christianity per se, but at least they're not just doing what you tell them to do, not about religion, but in the first place, these are the first missions, or at least the first serious ones led by the Byzantine Empire. The Vikings are not normally Christians yet, and in any case, when they will become so, they will have been absorbed by the Roman Church. So it's really another space that the Byzantines can't quite reach that easily, even as far as the unavoidable conversion of these peoples was involved. Right, there was in part even surely a calculation behind that. Right, you can argue that think about Photius and the first proto-schism with the West, where it was occurring now. So the Rusians were significantly distant from the Mediterranean to be properly just having relations with the papacy, but say the Moravians, the Bulgarians were, of course, playing with the papacy, because they knew that from the struggle with Constantinople they could earn something in exchange, as far as the conversion their people was involved, under whose authority they would have fallen in that regard, etc. The most important event here, aside from the broader Byzantine cultural influence in support of imperial foreign policy being spread, is the 867 patriarchal annunciation that the Rus had accepted a bishop, and that in 874 the same patriarch spoke of an archbishop of the Rus, which, as we will see better in other videos, doesn't mean that they converted at the time, but this news are correct, and they refer to the fact that at least the Rus had accepted a Christian presence. Surely there were Christians already within the Rus spontaneously, and the having such a prestigious spiritual figure from the same Constantinople, that, let's remember, this whole game is the center of the world, right? Especially as far as Eastern Europe is concerned. Like, this is the big empire. This is where God basically has turned to more favorably, and the universe, in a sense, revolves around this, right? The famous Miklagard, the great fortress, that is, from a Scandinavian perspective of the 9th century, objectively the largest thing they've ever seen, the most impressive one. And so the relations between the Rus and the Byzantines were already working before Oleg took control of Kiev. This reflected, as we've seen, a broader need of commercial, cultural, and military connection, but also conflict between the two powers, because again, the inherent potential, this, as we've seen, was being unleashed, like from the Rus, that had not yet met with the Byzantine Empire, so nobody really understood how far the frontier should go, and also how the various spheres of influence had to be established, right, with one another. The wealth and income of the Rus depended heavily, however, on the trade with Constantinople. Constantine VII describes actually the annual course of the princes of Kiev collecting tribute from client tribes as a big deal. They had a significant core of forces managing to exact, right, to roaming around, taming this rebel, this other, exacting tribute, destroying this other tribe if they wouldn't pay, and they were busy, right, and they would eventually assemble the product into a flotilla of hundreds of boats, and they would move this, in fact, floating market down to the Dnipro to the Black Sea. Interestingly enough, they were so seaborne, at least from the Norse influence there, from Viking influence, that they would have essentially a huge movable market. They would sail at that point to the estuary of the Dniester River, up to the Danubian Delta, and even to Constantinople. So some of the major trade routes, as you know, the Danube at this point was very active in trade between the Eastern and Western Empire. The Rus Slavic traffics mostly got down to the Black Sea, as far as at least the Mediterranean world was the more advanced, the richer, the most active economic was concerned. So this tells you the level of entrepreneurship and of just a force of willingness to simply live in such way and expanding your own market in such a fashion and showing yourself under the sun, right? Constantine VII says that the Rus returning home together with this giant floating market would carry with themselves back home silk, fabrics, spices, wine, and fruit that they didn't have much where they were coming from. They would bring naturally things like, you can imagine, furs, slaves, timber, things like that, and weapons as well for that matter, because there was at least they're also a complicated market. There was a lot of Byzantine weapons were imported, telling the truth, in the process, but they were also warlike people enough for themselves, and they had access. Again, this is just the north-south route, right? There is the east-west one, from which lots of stuff really they can get, as far as even, again, Turkic equipment, etc. The importance of the Russian-Byzantine trade relationship led, of course, also to military action when disputes arose, because what about these activities? How did prices have to be regulated? What were just the boundaries? Where simply could the Rus push up to, and which kind of markets was this impacting, etc. In fact, the Russian Primary Chronicle reports that the Rus attacked Constantinople again in 907. The problem being most likely at least to the securing of trade access, because naturally the Byzantines traded with lots of other peoples, and they wouldn't necessarily just make these Rus enter their commercial system just how they wanted. And again, these people were habituated to move in arms. They were dangerous, right? They were capable of carrying out, again, seaborne operations, threatening the same Constantinople, in fact, with them. And so this inherent sense of, again, give me what I want at the price I want, otherwise I will carry out military retaliations, it's quite powerful. and again, the Rus are the primitives here. They have the force. The Byzantines too have that, but they don't. They benefit more from invading other places, and they can't quite simply carry out an operation and in the Rus, say, besiege Kiev, right? They don't have properly the means. It would be constantly harassed by guerrilla. Their supply lines would be constantly under threat. It would be a titanic operation for what? For destroying Kiev, and then, and all the wealth you had spent in this couldn't be, used to consolidate another fertile agricultural region in the Mediterranean, right, where there was already maybe some substratum of Byzantine culture already to reconquer from the west, from Islam, right? That's the actual point, right? Because the Rus do not have themselves the military potential to simply threaten Constantinople in a more consistent fashion, right? They couldn't quite besiege Constantinople themselves. So nobody is really a winner if you think about that. In any case, there are legendary informations, especially from the Russian primary chronicle, regarding the military prowess and shrewdness of Oleg in this circumstance. It's mostly legions, right? Actually, the Byzantine sources do not even mention the Russian attack to Constantinople. Yet we think that this really happened because a pair of treaties in exactly 907 and 911 set forth a trade agreement with the Rus, right? And the terms read like, the Byzantines had been significantly pressured by this. The Rus were granted with quarters and supplies for their merchants and tax-free trading privileges in Constantinople. So in a way, the Byzantines began to give in part, and to allow the Rus sound their request. The primary chronicle provides also a story of how Oleg died, right? Basically, this is just anecdotal, right? A sorcerer prophesied that he would die in connection, broadly meant, with a horse. So Oleg had his own horse killed, or at least it had been, say, sequestered. It had been isolated somewhere, and then the animal died. And when Oleg visited the animal, because consider what this meant. The horse is the symbol, again, of the chivalric, apotheosis, the transfiguration, the sense of one's capacity to rise to heaven, and so on. So this is actually a pretty dark chthonic cult that legend, actually, that at least tells us how traditionally Oleg this is a bit like the sense of doom always incoming in the Norse sagas, with the hero that does just that minimal thing wrong, and he loses everything, right? This is the greatest concern for all Indo-European mythology since ever, right? The impending doom, the rotten, like the storming of the Asgard, the age of the wolf, the rotten foundations of the world. In fact, while Oleg goes to see his dead horse, he says, "Phew, finally my horse is dead." So the sorcerer was just saying BS. Instead, what happens is that the most chthonic animal, so he basically gives up, his possibility to control everything, like the Catholic imperial traditional domination would have, always to make him stay pretty awake in front of every possible threat. In fact, what comes out of the horse carcass is a snake that beats Oleg, who is poisoned and dies as a consequence. This is fascinating because it's part of the primary chronicle, and it tells you how strong even certain chthonic fears really were in that world. Even such a huge figure like Oleg, right, could succumb really to infamously at the end of the day to evil, to the obscure, to the dark forces of the darkness. So Prince Igor succeeds Oleg. We are in 912-13. There is some war against the Drablians, that are another Slavic people that basically harasses, especially the Khivans in the northeast, and they're a bit like the barbarians of the situation, at least the enemies par excellence. We will see also in other videos better what the wars with them were about. There are wars with the Pechenegs as well, after which, however, a period of peace ensues, roughly 2 decades. Right, so there is essentially a stabilization that derives from the temporary settlement with Byzantine affairs. In 941, the same Igor, however, launches another major attack on Constantinople. From Kiev, probably for the same reason of the 907 one. I mean, obtaining better or new or even old trading rights. That this situation had changed in Constantinople. And we are told of a navy of 10,000 vessels, which is a bit of an exaggeration, that, however, makes you understand how complex, because here there were vessels in terms also of supply, cargoes, right, for attacking Constantinople. We know that even the Pechenegs actually had troops and seaborne ones, let's say, at least means to move troops on water. And this major Russian force lands on the Bithynian coast, devastating the Asian shore of the Bosphorus, just in front of Constantinople. The attack was well prepared, as much as well timed, perhaps through the Russian merchant intelligence, right? Really, these campaigns were never just even secret per se, right? There was a general awareness of what these empires were doing at the same time when their field armies were occupied on a faraway frontier, things like that. Specifically, the Byzantine fleet, which could threaten the Russian one during the attack to Constantinople, was occupied with the Arabs in the Mediterranean, right, while the bulk of the imperial forces were stationed on the eastern frontier. So again, the Rus even here can't quite seize Constantinople, right? But they make a real mess. They burn towns after having pillaged them, together with churches, monasteries. They, at least we are told also by Byzantine sources about these massacres, people being crucified, like in offense to Christianity. A lot of booty is unmasked. Lots of also people are deported in slavery. However, seemingly, again, the information is relatively, you can say unreliable just per se, but we don't know technically what happened for real. In any case, the emperor managed to gather a small group of retired ships, equipping them with liquid fire throwers, the siphons, which again were not really the super weapon that somebody wants them to be. Always remember, it's all about doctrine. Technology is secondary, and there are very say limited circumstances which you can use, especially these flamethrowers, effectively. And admittedly, the Bosphorus waters are the calm ones that you need. Always watching out, however, the currents, the wind, because otherwise you'll set on fire your own same fleet. So much so that this naval force is sent out to meet with the Rus in the first place. They are lured into surrounding the same contingent before unleashing the liquid fire. This, again, we don't know whether it happened like this or not, right? Because battle. So I made a video about, I think, Byzantine, naval tactics. I think it was, I don't remember, I have to check. Well, you will find the Byzantine warfare playlist. It's either, I think I made 2 videos, one about Byzantine naval warfare during the 10th century, so we're in the same exact period, and also something about Byzantine sailor of the same century, so that gives you an idea more or less what, how overrated naturally naval warfare really was, right? Most of the naval forces at this time were just meant to defend the supplies of supply lines of the armies moving across along the coast, being supplied, in fact, from the same sea. In any case, Liutprand of Cremona, that was an Ottonian ambassador to Constantinople, wrote that, quote, "The Rus, seeing the flames, jumped overboard, preferring water to fire. Some sank, weighed down by the weight of their breastplates and helmets. Others caught fire, and those captured were beheaded." Because again, this was really a very vicious attack. At least the Byzantine sources record this event in very dramatic tone, and surely it had been a major blow, just even to you strike Constantinople, you really show the provinces that they're vulnerable, and lots of moral consequences can follow. But this ploy did manage as well to dispel the Russian fleet, right? That went on attacking actually the hinterland as far as Nicomedia at some point. So again, the major Byzantine forces could not simply dislodge these guys simply. And as we've seen, the Rus were quite pervasive. They would essentially, they were masters in landing, raiding, coming back with loot, right, and so on. Because in the meanwhile, Major and even other Byzantine territories, of course, being unprotected by the Russian attacks, right? We hear again of the atrocities carried out by the Rus. There is an imperial army finally arriving from the Balkans that manages to drive the enemy away, right? We know of some naval forces destroying, reportedly at least, much of the Russian fleet on its return voyage, which may be an exaggeration, just like the apprehending of an otherwise pretty tragic reality. In fact, we know that the Russians mounted another attack pretty soon later, so it's unlikely that their seaborne capabilities were significantly crippled after this expedition. However, overall, again, this is not the Russians taking over the Byzantine Empire, right? Still, the latter is the strongest, so much so that from the early 10th century, the Byzantines definitely begin to rise to a point that forces the Russians to accept just the fact that they can't properly make a major breakthrough, right? That this probably hadn't been their intention in the first place, in at least if not in an optimistic sense. The Byzantine Empire, is actually re-expanding dramatically. Maybe it is exactly about the time of the 10th century reconquest, the pale death of the Saracens, and it is all, in fact, the Christianization of the Kievan Rus that basically takes place in the following generation, right? And the Prince Igor returned to Kiev for revenge, by the way, because of the, at least the fact that the Byzantines had, to a degree, managed to dislodge the Rus with force. Igor assembled another large force, again together with his Slavic and Pecheneg tributaries, and sent even 4 reinforcements of Varangians across the Baltic Sea, right to Scandinavia. Meaning that, again, here there is an opportunity if you want to join. We're making this thing again. Let's see what happens. In 944, the Rus attacked the Byzantines again, by land and sea, as it was normal practically. An imperial force from Kherson responded, right? And the Byzantines decide, by the way, in this situation, not to to force hand, right, to make a bloodbath from both sides. They send gifts, right? They say basically, look, we are friendly. There is no need to fight for this, right, to this point, because naturally there was a lot of tension from the, also from Russian internal policy to say, okay, well, if you have been repelled, like you're not a true leader, all these kind of things. But the Byzantines do not want that. They want actually to co-opt these people, and so Igor namely accepts this gift that would have made him even more powerful at home, and so at least would have compensated someone for the lack of loot that could have gathered, however, at the risk of, again, another significant defeat that could have just worsened the situation. So there is an exchange of say embassies, let's call it in this way, between the Rus, the Byzantines, even the Bulgarians. That, again, I'm making it very simple. We will hopefully resume the series also about Bulgarian history, because naturally much of also this game was played with the Bulgarians in between, right? And every time the Byzantines suffered a blow, as you know, that the Bulgarians raided Greece, from the Balkans and so on, was basically the same thing all the time. And unsurprisingly, the agreement focused mostly on trade, right? What these two powers could get from one another was essentially consolidating very specific commercial relations, right, that would essentially become preferential, right, with one another. This was the only way to just ensure that the Russian princes would have that specific income that could be used to consolidate locally as well, because Constantinople was definitely not the only concern of Kiev, as we've seen. There was an interesting set of regulations regarding the Russian mercantile presence in Kherson and Constantinople, even with specific punishments for violations of the law, because as we've seen, these were, at least up to this point, just pirates, right? So they weren't also particularly refined people in a sense. Let's say that their presence in a specific quarter in specific areas could become dangerous for the city or unrest, because again they could simply pass to arms quite easily, and there was essentially a mob here, right? There was the Byzantine one, the Russian one, and one of of other peoples in the largest market around, and they would often make brawls, right? Set things on fire, kill each other, right? It was, again, pretty normal. Yeah, but sometimes imperial forces had difficulties to police this effectively, and Constantinople would have had just a damage image, let's put it this way, aside from the actual material losses. And of course, it was a sense of revenge because the merchants went crying to the prince, saying, "Look, the Byzantines did this to us. We are the ones that rule here in the city. Trade as well. Without you, without us, you couldn't be really a prince." So it was always this kind of very delicate balance that we'll see again better in other videos. And what remains really at this point is the necessity of simply stabilizing, right, through a Byzantine-Russian alliance, and say essentially giving to the Rus also what was their due as far as the Pechenegs and the Bulgarians could join with them, and this would have become a consistent force to threaten the empire entirely, right? So there is a shift for which the Byzantines and the Rus decide to just act in tandem and excluding a bit the rest from the area. Also because the Rus is kind of just, again, they have this naval capacity, but it's not, as we've seen, first of all, enough to threaten entirely the unity of the empire, to the point of the Russians just investing too much on it. Kiev is distant enough. There are large spaces, right? So there is not like an immediacy of threat territorially, like with the Bulgarians that are literally a few tens of kilometers away from Constantinople on a regular basis. The Pechenegs, as we've seen, are a bit of a problem for the same Rus, so there is the sense that the stabilization, especially of a Kievan principality, has to pass through a normalized relation with the empire that can simply provide with this enormous cultural capacity to stabilize the internal rule, right, in an ever more monarchic direction with a conversion and so on. Igor died in 945 during a military expedition. His wife Olga ruled as a regent of Kiev. I talked about her in the video about Rastislav and also the conversion of the Khazars, as it's that phase in which, as you know, she allegedly came to Constantinople and she accepted Christianization. That the Christianization would happen under Vladimir the Great, right? That was the natural son of Sviatoslav. That was the son of Igor and Olga, right? Sviatoslav reached maturity in 963. He fought, he ruled for a decade, and he fought against an impressive amount of peoples, right? Pretty much everybody around, right? And consolidated thus a very strong position. This is when the Khazars of the Pontic steppe are practically taken out entirely. There is an invasion of the Balkans, by the way, in 967 and 68, which is also very much messed up with, again, the Bulgarians. In the meanwhile, in any case, the Kievan Rus would be defeated during this campaign as well. Will be defeated, and this is when most of probably the Norse component, right, of this kind of warlike, de facto, say, semi-professional or fully professional, considering their lifestyle, Norse mercenaries was killed, right, in the on the Danube, in other in other places all around, where they kept launching raids. Some of these people were hired by the same Byzantines as we were remembering before. But overall, there is the sense that the Slavic element takes truly the full control of the Kievan world, and this facilitates also the political stabilization. The Kievan Rus is namely at this point the largest state in Europe. Right, Eastern Europe is naturally less densely populated. It has less communication routes. There are less resources, but it's still a massive system that we will see better as far as properly the needs of consolidation are concerned, because it's not just about war, right? Or at least it is, but still part of a political say action that must be understood in its Schwerpunkt, as a matter of fact. By the end of his short life, Sviatoslav carved out for himself such dominion and moved at some point even his residence, at least from Kiev to Peresliavets. That was a trade city located near the mouths of the Danube, right, in 969. This was done just during the aforementioned war that the sense served for a more kind of direct supervision of what was happening in the Balkans, for intervening more successfully, etc. While Olga, Sviatoslav's mother, had converted to Christianity, and there are lots of troubles again happening at home. Again, today we do not see it, but we'll in other videos regarding Christianization, whether it was too early, too late, right? This depended on whichever faction prevailed, right, in the principality, whatever. Sviatoslav, in fact, is, together with his drudzina, so his retinue, right, and his following, right, his bodyguards, right, he remained a staunch pagan, right. He died in an ambush in 972, by the way. His possessions will actually consolidate, as we've seen overall. However, the main problem remains still for Rus the problem of as many powers of an informal, let's say, a lack of formalization of the succession to government, and this would bring, even among a people that was not fully dynastic, right, the Rurikid dynasty would be affirmed, but at this point we are still in a clanic direction, right? So there is a fratricidal feud among Sviatoslav's sons, which would result in two of his three being killed. So that's the level of internal dialectic, let's put it in this way, that is still to be addressed, right? However, the golden age of the Kievan Rus is yet to come, and we will see it hopefully in another video. I hope to have given you just like a general picture of what I wanted to point out, and again, I can't stress it enough, these are just introductions, right? So not very short, but surely very, very compact, right? For all the things that we have to learn about these places and events related, it's really too few. That's why I make all these videos in the first place. Anyhow, For today, stop it here, and just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.